There is a racist police officer walking through a wealthy neighborhood. He sees a black guy on a walk and thinks, the man must be up to no good, so the officer stops him for no reason. Later, the officer learns that he charged a very important general in the U.S. Army named General Michael Adams. He walked down one of these tree-lined streets, his steps soft on the ground. Michael was tall and strong. Even though he looked normal, he had an athletic build that suggested he had been in the military for a long time. Michael exuded an air of power in this situation, evident in the way he stood and moved. He was well known in the neighborhood, but not everyone was aware that he owned a house just a few blocks away. He bought it years ago as a quiet place to get away from the stress of his job. It became a place where he could relax and escape. Despite the stress of his duties, he chose to go for a walk today, as he often did, and enjoy the silence of the streets as the sun sank in the late afternoon. Michael kept walking with longer shadows behind him. He was unaware of the impending events that would disrupt his current peaceful routine. He was just another person enjoying the ease of a late summer afternoon and finding peace in everyday things. Officer James Davis looked in his rearview mirror as he did this. As he slowly drove down the street, he looked around the area like a hawk looking for prey. The engine in his police car was barely running, and the car was moving slowly. Davis had done this many times before to make sure the streets of this wealthy neighborhood stayed safe and clean. I appreciated his actions and believed he was the final line of defense against any threats to peace. The neighborhood and community were very quiet, almost too quiet. Davis put his hand on the steering wheel, mindlessly listening to a song he could barely make out over the sound of the car's hum. I saw the usual sights, like kids riding bikes against fences, workers cutting back hedging, and the occasional jogger or dog walker might pass by. Everything seemed fine until he saw him. Black man strolling down the street by himself. Davis's eyes narrowed as he looked at the man's face. He looked good. He was tall and strong, and he was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. He walked with a relaxed gait and didn't seem to be in a hurry. There was nothing particularly strange about him, but Davis didn't recognize the man, and that was enough to make him suspicious. Davis muttered under his breath, "Who are you?" while maintaining eye contact. Davis had been a police officer for 10 years when the man asked, "What are you doing here?" He was confident enough to trust his instincts, and these instincts were warning him that something wasn't right. This was mostly wealthy. Davis lived in a white neighborhood filled with individuals who didn't conform to the norm. Davis wasn't going to just let the guy get away with his crimes. The man might have lost his way or developed an interest in houses. He drives by without finding out more, so he slows down the car even more to keep pace. He watched the man walk by and saw him quickly look over at the car. His face was calm. Not interested, Davis's jaw clenched. The man's calmness annoyed him. It was like the man. His presence didn't bother him at all. He seemed to fit there. Davis didn't like it, so he made a quick choice. He pulled his police car over to the curb, parked it, and got out to fix his belt in the radio clip. The man kept walking, as if he didn't notice the cop coming up behind him. Davis felt a flicker of frustration and raised his voice as he walked toward the man. "Hey, Davis!" When Davis called out, the man stopped and turned to face him. He gazed directly into Davis's eyes. Davis didn't blink or move when he asked, "Officer, is there a problem?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at the man closely. The man's face was calm, and his stance was relaxed. He acted as though he didn't perceive Davis as a threat, which heightened Davis's suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Davis asked in an upset voice. "Just going for a walk." The man answered, "Evenly? That's not allowed." Davis frowned because he didn't like the man's answer. Davis liked being in a tone so calm and unbothered that it made him feel like he wasn't the one in charge. Controlling himself, he stepped closer and squared his shoulders. "I need to see some ID," Davis said in a loud voice. The man in charge raised an eyebrow but remained motionless. "What am I being charged with?" Davis was losing his temper over something. "This is a private area. There aren't many people like you around here." The man sighed. "I have the right to question anyone who seems out of place." As the man said, "I live nearby," Davis became increasingly angry. A few blocks away, Davis said, "I'm not doing anything wrong, officer. I'm just enjoying a walk. Show me your ID." He didn't want to do what his hand was instinctively doing, which was to move toward his belt, where his radio and other power tools were hanging. He faced resistance because his training had taught him that being in charge was crucial in these situations. The man reached into his. He carefully and slowly pulled out his wallet and held it up to Davis to show his ID. Davis took it. When he looked at the name and address, he was surprised for a moment to see that it was a real home in the area. Even though the man seemed calm, something still didn't feel right to him. It could have been Davis's. As his own sense of duty kicked in, Davis said, "I've never seen you around here before. How long have you been here?" Having lived here for a few years, the man answered, "I'm not usually out much because I work." "Get this done," Davis said with anger in his face. He didn't like being questioned, especially by someone who seemed to think they were safe from suspicion. Their grip on the man's ID got tighter. Davis snapped, "We've heard of some strange goings-on in the area. I need to make sure everything is okay." So the man kept quiet, his eyes still fixed on Davis. He wasn't scared. Davis showed no signs of backing down. He hated being the one in charge here, not some stranger who thought he could walk wherever he wanted. He had to show that he was in charge. Davis told them to stay put and not move, and then he turned around and went back to his police car. His heart was beating a little faster now, preparing him to run the ID. He felt a mixture of anger and an inexplicable emotion. As he got to the car, Davis took another look at the man who was standing still and waiting. He didn't want to admit that he had doubts. Davis's chest tightened. Something about this didn't feel right. He pushed that thought out of his mind. As a police officer, it was his job to keep this neighborhood safe, no matter what. Davis couldn't afford to second-guess himself right now. He sat in his police car and looked at He saw a man in the rearview mirror and felt uneasy as he started to type the guy's information into the system. It was like a storm cloud in the sky, ready to break. Michael stood on the ground and watched as Officer Davis walked back to his police car. He could feel the officer's heat, even though he was far away on the street. Despite the sounds of birds singing and Davis's police car humming in the background, the silence remained unbroken. Michael kept his cool. He kept his cool and his breathing steady. He knew he had done nothing wrong, so he had nothing to hide. It was the way Davis looked at him, the questions he asked, and the demand that he show his ID. Michael tensed up, thinking about the exchange and the officer's situation. The way he held Michael's hand showed that he thought he was out of place. Michael had seen that look before. It was like he was ready for anything. Many times during his service, a mix of suspicion and authority was shown to people who were seen as different or out of the ordinary. This glance had the potential to escalate into something far more sinister if Michael didn't exercise caution. He took a few quick glances around the room. From afar, people were now looking through windows or stopping in their yards to see what was going on. As the water spilled onto the sidewalk, a middle-aged guy with a garden hose stood there and watched. As she walked her dog, she put her phone down as if she were going to record. Michael looked at her for a moment. She turned away, and he took a slow, deep breath. He didn't want a scene to happen. Fight Davis was still in his car, typing away on his computer. Michael knew the police officer was looking at his ID and records to find a reason for the stop. He had witnessed it prior to the fishing expedition, but he didn't initially understand why. It didn't make sense to him, but he also knew that getting angry wouldn't help his patience, so he told himself, let it go. Scene. Davis exited the police car, still holding his ID. He was a mask of anger. He walked back over to Michael, stopping just a foot away and trying to stand a little taller. Devi said something that sounded like he was upset, but it was in a way that showed he was confident. Michael calmly said, I already told you that doesn't explain why you're here. I told you I lived here and was just going for a walk. Davis's eyes got narrow. Strange behavior has been reported, and it's my job to investigate. Michael kept his eyes on the ground. I get that. Officer, I'm not causing any disturbance. I'm simply strolling, Davis stated. Davis's anger was clear. His face turned a little red. With a frown on his face, he looked around and saw that they had a small crowd. He didn't like being in front of people. When the officer was challenged, particularly in front of others, Michael could sense a shift, a soft edge beginning to creep in. Stand look, Davis said in a low voice. We can do this the easy way, or we can advance if you don't tell me what you're doing. It's totally up to me. Michael was upset at you, but he held it in because he knew this was a detrimental move, intimidating someone until they gave up. I've told you everything you need to know, Michael answered calmly. You're wrong, Davis said, his jaw tightening. The only mistake I see is someone believes they can stroll through this neighborhood unnoticed or unquestioned. Are you going to help me with this, or do I need to take it to the next level? Michael was losing his cool. He had tried to reason with Davis and explain, but he wasn't listening. It wasn't about safety. It was about control and asserting authority over someone he perceived as a threat. Danger based on looks. Michael glanced at the onlookers before turning his gaze back to Davis. Officer, I'm not, Michael said in a steady voice. I'm resisting, but I also know my rights. You have no right to arrest me. I've done nothing wrong. Davis snapped. I'll decide what's wrong and what's right. His eyes became red with anger. He warned Michael and grabbed him by the arm, saying, You're coming with me, Michael, tensing as he tightened his grip. His training was paying off. He knew he could easily beat the cop, but he didn't. It would make things worse. So he let Davis pull him toward the patrol car, feeling the roughness of the cuffs on his wrists. Michael asked, Is this really necessary? Davis ignored him, pushing Michael to the back of the group. He barked at Michael, who obeyed by sitting down in the back seat with his hands on the seats. With his hands and feet cuffed behind him, he gazed out at the people observing. Their faces showed a mix of surprise and worry. With the dog had her phone up and was filming the whole thing. Michael hoped that was enough. In order to keep things from getting worse, Davis slammed the door shut. Michael felt a wave of anger wash over him, and now he was sitting in the back of a police car. He had gone for a quiet walk to clear his thoughts. The color of his skin and the assumptions that came with it made him feel like a thief. Davis was talking on the radio, and Michael could hear his voice getting tense as he told the station what was going on. Taking another deep breath, he knew this wasn't over yet, and as much as he was ready to fight back, but he knew he had to keep his cool, because this wasn't just about him. The situation was far more significant than what he was confronting in the back of a police car. It was something he had dealt with all his life. Even with his hands tied behind his back, Michael's fight for equality and respect continued. Michael sat in the quiet police station. The cold metal of the police car still held his arms in shackles. He kept his eyes on the road and didn't pay attention to the looks that Officer Davis sometimes gave him in the rearview mirror. The busy roads leading into town blur the views from the area's tree-lined streets. Instead of fear, Michael was shocked by how strange things were. It was only a short walk before Davis pulled into the station and parked his car in a lot full of... He got out of the car, yanked open the back door, and grabbed Michael by the arm. The station was packed with people. Police officers are constantly coming and going, conversing on radios and holding files. Davis led Michael inside. A few cops in ERS looked their way with interest in their eyes, but Davis didn't pay attention. As they dragged Michael down the hall to the holding area, he could feel the other officers' eyes on him. Whispers said it wasn't the first time people looked at him closely, but it felt like the first. Michael had spent his entire life getting into trouble with the law, which he swore to protect. He was maintaining order and safeguarding his nation, but now a police station was treating him like a common criminal. Davis opened a door to a small room and led Michael inside. It was a normal room. There were no walls in the waiting room, just a table and 2 chairs. Davis waved Michael to sit down. Davis stood by the door, his arms crossed and a smug expression on his face, as Michael followed his instructions. "You'll stay here until we get there," he said. "Fix this," Davis said in a shaky voice. Michael looked him in the eye. "What are we really trying to figure out, officer? You have my ID and know where I live. What else do you need Davis's eyes for?" "Made me angry. I need to know why you were in that neighborhood and how you thought you could walk around like you owned the place." Michael sighed, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "I wasn't. I live in that area and haven't done anything wrong to deserve this treatment." Davis's face. "People with your level of flush don't just walk around neighborhoods like that for no reason." He may have been visiting houses in search of a chance. Michael's eyes squinted at people like me. He asked again, "What exactly do you mean by that?" Officer Davis's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. The room fell into a strange silence, and Michael could feel the strain in the air. Michael knew that this wasn't about him. It was about his anger and his need to be in charge to make a point. What he stood for to Davis was a threat to the order he was so eager to keep. The door opened, and Sergeant Laura Smith walked in. She was a tall woman with short brown hair, and her face showed a mix of business and shock. With worry, she looked at Davis and then at Michael, her eyes judging. Michael knew the kind of person she was and kept cool, speaking in a voice of reason. "Sergeant Smith, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice steady. Davis stood up and saw him walking in. The nice neighborhood acting suspiciously, he wouldn't explain himself. So I brought him inside, where Smith looked at Michael. Her eyes were sharp but fair. "Is that true?" Michael nodded a little, and I was out. Officer Davis stopped me for a walk and asked to see my ID. I showed him and told him I lived nearby, but that wasn't enough for him. "SM, did you check his ID?" Davis quickly answered, "Yes." "It came back clean, but you still brought him in." Smith cut her off and asked Davis what the reason was. Hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with Smith's close attention. He was acting suspiciously. He demanded I as part of her job. Smith crossed her arms and sighed. "This man is a high-ranking official." "General in the U.S. Army," she said in a low but clear voice. "You've brought him in without a reason in handcuffs, and you know what this means," Davis said with a blink. He looked at Michael and then back at Smith, clearly shocked. "I didn't know," he stuttered, and Smith's eyes got narrow. "You should guard and serve, not judge based on how he looks. It shouldn't matter who he is." Davis let him go right away because it wasn't okay. Davis fumbled with the keys as he stepped forward to unlock the cuffs. After being held tight by the metal, Michael's wrists were freed. He lightly rubbed them to feel the pain from the tight grip. Standing taller than Davis, Michael maintained a calm demeanor. "Thank you for being so polite, but this isn't just about me. It's about how people like Officer directed us to their duty station." Smith nodded and said, "I agree. We'll talk about this." More than that, General Adams can rest assured that this situation will be handled properly. Michael looked at Davis. Michael, still looking shocked, said, "I hope this wakes you up." Quietly judging someone based on how they look can be wrong. Dangerous ones. Smith pointed to the "Open the door and bring this to my office. She told me we need to talk about what happened here." Today, as they walked out of the holding room, Michael walked next to Smith. He could feel the other officers' eyes on him. They knew it wasn't over, but it was a start. They understood the need to discuss the situation, implement necessary changes, and determine whether this was the final step. If that was the catalyst, then so be it. Back in Smith's office, Michael sat beside her. The mix of emotions left Davis standing outside. Michael looked at him through the window and felt confused and embarrassed. He thought about the long road ahead. It was the culture that allowed those things to happen, not just one cop. Michael had endured battles throughout his life, and he intended to persevere through this one until its conclusion. The fight for equality and respect didn't stop on the battlefield. It went off to every street and neighborhood in every city. Smith put down her pen and looked up at Michael. "I'm sorry about what happened," she said. "We'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Not be forgotten." Michael nodded. "It's not about saying sorry, Sergeant. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else again." Smith agreed. "So let's begin with, we'll start with Officer Davis and then look at the bigger picture. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it has to begin." There was a strange silence in Sergeant Laura Smith's small office while Michael sat across from her. Sergeant Smith was sitting on his knees with his face calm but aware. He had just finished taking notes. Michael's story of what happened. Her pen was left on the desk, and she forgot about it as she thought about what to do next. Outside, the noise of the station's activities continued, but inside there was a sense of stress. Smith took a deep breath, breaking the quiet. "And General Adams, I assure you that today's behavior is not representative. Officer Davis's acts were wrong." Michael nodded slightly and stated that such behavior is not acceptable here. "Yeah, Sergeant, I understand, but I've seen this happen too many times for it to be new." About one police officer. It's about the way people think that lets this keep happening. Smith's eyes flickered with, having been a police officer for a long time, she knew Michael was right. It wasn't just about one event. She joined the police force to bring about change and safeguard the larger issues. Law and things like this made her understand how far they still had to go. "Listen carefully," Adam Smith said. "If you don't mind, I'd like to hear your take. Discussing your experience today and in the past may help us prevent this from happening again." Michael leaned forward and looked into Smith's eyes. "Sergeant, I've dedicated my entire life to. During my service, I led troops, made choices in battle, and dealt with all sorts of crises. I also had to deal with discrimination, both subtle and overt. Yesterday was calm, but today was different. They treated me like a thief for simply walking in my own space. I fought for this country, but people see me as a threat because of the way I look." Smith looked at her face. "Take it easy, General. We're here to protect everyone, but you're right. Sometimes we let our own views get in the way, cloud Davis's judgment. He's been a decent cop, but this isn't the first time I've heard that he's been upset." Michael agreed. "It's not just about punishing Davis. It's also about making sure that the police officer knows that their job is to protect and not to judge. This kind of racial targeting is dangerous. Makes people not trust the cops, and when that happens, we've failed." Smith put her pen down and looked at her notes. She had always taken pride in her fairness and welcoming nature, but it was clear that not everyone agreed with that point of view. Smith said Davis would be conducting an internal review, suspended as a result. But we need to think more about how we train our police and how we deal with the Michael appreciated Smith's sincerity. She wasn't just mouthing platitudes. She appeared to be genuinely dedicated to Michael, stated that education and training are just the beginning. But it's also important to consider the people in charge of accountability need to know that acts like these have results, and not just for the Smith agreed. Let's start by holding Davis. We will review our training programs after holding them accountable. We need to build trust, not just police it. Laws. At that moment, Smith's office door opened and Officer Davis stood there looking uncertain. Smith made a hand sign. He stepped inside and stood stiffly by the door, waiting for Davis to come in. Going back and forth between Smith and Michael, Officer Davis, Smith started her tone. General Adams has calmly told his side of what happened today. We've looked into his background, and you now know that he's, as a high-ranking general in the U.S. Army, Davis. What you did was rude and not appropriate. Moved uncomfortably, the color of his face rising. I didn't know he was a general, Davis said in a defensive tone. Thought he was up to something. I was just doing my job. Smith's eyes got a little narrow. Your job is to protect. I ask everyone in this group not to judge people based on how they look. You arrested a man for no reason, treated him like a suspect, and broke his rights. That's not your job. That's not good enough. Davis opened his mouth to argue, but then shut it. He glanced at Michael once more, then turned his gaze back to Smith. I was just trying to keep Davis, the neighborhood safety officer, said that Michael stood up and faced the cop. It's not about attacking people because of their appearance. It's about doing the right thing and treating everyone with respect. I was out. For a walk, that's all. However, you made me feel like a thief in my own neighborhood, a feeling that bothers no one. Davis slouched a little and looked down to avoid Michael's eyes. I'm sorry, he mumbled. I didn't mean for Michael to watch as Davis apologized, but it seemed like he was telling the truth out of fear rather than understanding. It's not enough for Michael to say sorry. Smith stood up to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. She stood firm and told Officer Davis, "You're suspended right away, and your actions will be looked into. We will take further actions based on the results." Davis nodded, looking defeated, and he turned. He quietly left the office, leaving the door behind him with a soft click. Smith watched him leave and then turned. She told Michael, "We can do better." "I'll make sure of it." Michael agreed. "Although I agree with you, Sergeant, this isn't just about Davis. It's about changing the system that lets this happen, the right way to act, and it starts with leaders and soldiers like Smith." He sat down again and looked thoughtful. "Thank you for your patience today, General. I know it hasn't been easy. However, what you said will make a difference." Michael took a deep breath and felt the stress of the day start to lift. "Sergeant, we all have a part to play. Let's make sure we do it well." He stood up and put out his hand. Smith shook it strongly, and there was silence. As Michael left the office, he felt like he had a purpose. Despite the fear, this event presented an opportunity. Making things better wasn't about him, it was about preventing others. To go through what he did, Michael stepped out into the light and felt determined. The road ahead was long. He was still going ahead, but at least he wasn't walking alone. Word quickly spread about what had happened to General Michael Adams. Whispers got through the police office and into the community by the next day. The cops, huddled together in break rooms, engaged in intense conversations and whispers. People in the station were tense because they knew that Officer Davis's empty desk was being looked at. The suspension of Davis clearly signaled a significant event. It was more than just a punishment. Sergeant Laura Smith stood in front of the cops at the morning briefing and told them that things were changing. As many of you know, Officer Davis has a serious face and a steady voice. An internal probe into the incident involving General Michael Adams has placed him on leave. Our standards. We're here to serve and protect everyone in the community, and that means treating everyone with... There was a murmur in the room, and some cops nodded to show their agreement. Others looked uneasy and moved around in their seats. Smith saw the different responses, but kept pushing us to do what he wanted. Think about the whole department. Things like this undermine public trust, and we cannot tolerate that. One of the officers, a young man, said, "We have a duty to do better and hold ourselves to the highest standards of conduct." Officer Ramirez raised his hand and asked, "Sergeant, what's going to happen to Davis?" Smith met his eyes. "What happened next will depend on the investigation. I've suspended him for the time being, but I want to pursue this further. This isn't just about Davis. We all need to know our role. Profiling people based on their race or ethnicity has no place in this area." The room went quiet again. As the officers thought about what Smith had said, she continued, "We'll be holding more training sessions. I expect everyone to participate in the discussion on racial awareness and ways to calm things down. We need to ensure that this doesn't happen again." The lecture was over. Officers filed. Some left the room deep in thought, while others whispered to each other, "Smith." She hoped that what she had said had made a difference. She knew that change wouldn't happen right away, but it had to begin. In the meantime, General Michael Adams had gone back to his normal routines, but he often thought about, it wasn't just about what happened to him. It was about a bigger picture. Meanings. Smith called Michael and told him about the study and the steps that were being taken to deal with the problem. He appreciated her efforts, but he understood that this was just the beginning. In the afternoon of that day, Michael got an offer to meet with police and community leaders. Representatives wanted to talk about what had happened and how to move forward. Michael agreed, but he didn't fully understand what was going on. Because these talks are so important, the meeting took place in a big room at a nearby community center. The room was filled with chairs arranged in a circle. When Michael got there, he saw a mix of faces. There are police officers, community leaders, neighborhood activists, and a few people who live in St. Smith. Was there with Officer Ramirez and other officers from the department. Michael knew some of the neighborhood leaders. He had collaborated with these individuals on various projects over the years. When the meeting began, there was a palpable atmosphere. With much anticipation, an older woman called Mrs. Turner, a community leader, spoke up. She was polite but firm. "The group, thank you all for coming," she said. "We're here today because of There was an event that brought up problems we can't ignore anymore, General Adams. Thank you for sharing. It was an honor to be a part of this conversation and share your story." With all eyes on him, he took a deep breath and then spoke. "What happened to me was wrong," he said in a clear voice. "It's not just about me, though. It's important to ensure that everyone in our community feels safe and valued, and a police officer named Collins is sitting next to me." Smith spoke up. "We have to do better and make changes, but it will take time." "What do you think?" I think we should pay attention to Michael, who liked how open-ended the question was, so he said, "Start with training, but also on how to interact with people of color. Police officers need to know that their job is to protect. Don't scare and make it clear what will happen to people who cross." Mrs. Turner agreed with the line, "Trust is key right now. There's a lot of a lack of trust in the police, particularly among minorities. We need to know that the cops are on our side and not against us." Sergeant Smith then said, "We're starting to use new training methods right away, and we're also reviewing our stop and search rules. The purpose of stop and search rules extends beyond punishment. For education and prevention, we want to work with the community, not split it up," says a neighborhood activist. One of the people who had been listening quietly raised his hand. "It's good to hear that he said that he was committed to change, but we need to know that problems are dealt with directly when they come up, not swept under the rug." Michael agreed that openness and responsibility are very important. This can't just be words. People must be able to perceive changes and hear their opinions. I heard that the conversation continued indefinitely, covering a wide range of topics. Regular meetings for community involvement programs between police and residents, and how important it is for officers to be seen as partners instead of enforcers. Some people agreed on the same things, and a cautious optimism started to grow. When the meeting was over, Sergeant Smith went up to Michael and said, "Thank you for being here." Michael replied, "Your input is invaluable. I think we can make a real difference, even though we have a long way to go." Michael shook her hand. "No, change isn't easy. It's important, and I'm ready to work with all of you to make this community a place where everyone feels welcome." Smith nodded with a set look in her eyes and said, "We'll do it." As Michael and his friends left the community center, he felt hopeful that the talks had been honest. Although a significant amount of work remained, Michael was confident that genuine transformation was imminent. Time, patience, and hard work were needed, but he was ready for himself and his community. Everyone who believed in fairness and justice faced a challenging journey ahead, but Michael stood out. Officer James thought they were going in the right direction because the mood in the police station had changed. Davis's suspension made his point clear, and the morning meetings, which used to feel like nothing special, took on a new tone. Taking matters more seriously, a new emphasis was placed on industry and respect, and officers of accountability were required to undergo training on racial awareness and how to calm down a situation. Sessions that led to important but awkward talks were held, and in one of these sessions, Officer Ramirez and his fellow cops sat and listened as a trainer from the community relations team talked. Understanding your unconscious biases is crucial. Ramirez had been a police officer for a while and thought he was fair. Upon hearing the truth, he realized that he had also made rash decisions. The training made officers consider their behavior based on appearances without them even realizing it. Consider the potential impact of their actions on others after the training. Ramirez, I ran into Sergeant Laura Smith in the stairwell. She had been planning these meetings to push for real change. In the department, he could see both drive and weariness in her eyes. It wasn't straightforward to make a change. Sergeant Ramirez started to walk. He was breaking a tradition that had been around for years. Along with her, these lessons are opening a lot of eyes. I've heard other police officers talk about it. I think it's working now, Smith said with a small smile. She said with a smile, "That's the goal, B. We can't just expect that. Things are changing quickly, but we need to start somewhere. Every time we converse with an officer, their thoughts begin to shift." "That's a change for the better," Ramirez agreed. "I've been reflecting extensively on what transpired. I too have made mistakes. It wasn't as clear to me, but I've judged people before I even talked to them. These lessons are helping me understand how Smith touched Ramirez's life. We've all done terrible things, but what matters is that we learn from them and get better. It's not about perfection, it's about growth. The fact that you see this is a sign." As they walked, Smith couldn't help but feel hopeful that they were making progress. The fight with General Michael Adams shook the department, but it also set off an important chain of events. Knowing herself, being aware of her flaws, and wanting to get better, she knew there would still be pushback officers who she didn't think anything had to change, but she knew that many people were beginning to see why this was important. At the same time, Michael Adams was feeling the ripple effects of what he had been through. I received calls and messages from neighbors, some offering support and others expressing regret for not intervening sooner. They saw him get jailed. Michael appreciated that outreach recognized his situation. Many people, not just police, were enlightened by Michael. The neighborhood association invited him to speak at a community forum. The forum to foster residents and police should talk to each other to rebuild trust and address concerns. Michael agreed, understanding the importance of these talks. That night, the community center was packed with people. Residents were seated in the chairs, and a group of cops, like Sergeant Smith and Officer Ramirez, stood in the back. Michael walked out on stage and looked at the faces. There was a mix of fear, interest, and hope in the faces. Michael spoke into the crowd and said, "Thank you all for being here. What happened to me was difficult, yet it brought us all together tonight. I want to start by saying I believe in the power of community, and I think we can work together to make a safe place where everyone feels welcome." In a setting that was beneficial to everyone, he paused to allow his words to fully sink in. But that means we have to confront difficult realities, such as the existence of bias and prejudice, and comprehend the importance of safety. It's not just about keeping people safe from crime. It's also about ensuring that everyone feels appreciated and valued. No matter how they looked, an old man in the front row raised his hand and said, "General Adams, for more than 30 years I've lived here and seen how it changes. But I never thought something like this would happen." Michael said, "It starts here. How can we make sure it doesn't happen again?" He responded, "Awareness of our own biases, awareness of how our police are giving officers new training because their acts affect other people. But it's not just about the officers. We must be responsible for each other and report problems. Speaking up is important for gaining trust through action." Another person raised their hand. A young woman in the back asked, "What can we do as residents to help?" Michael replied, "Go to the meeting." The more we use these places to talk to our neighbors and get to know the police officers who patrol our streets, the better off we will all be. The more people who get involved, the stronger our community will be. It's about making connections and getting to know Sergeant Smith. They moved forward and joined Michael at the front. General Adams is right. They said, "We're going to make changes in the department, but we need your help. We are your police force and we want your cooperation. To better serve you, we're here to listen, learn, and make things better." The forum continued for more than an hour. Residents talked about their problems, asked questions, and made ideas for an hour. The atmosphere was open and welcoming. After Michael's death, polite, a big change from the stress. By the end of the night, there was a sense of togetherness among the crowd, and everyone was ready to move forward together. Friends flocked to Michael, eager to express their gratitude for his vocalization. When they discussed their personal experiences, he listened attentively and provided words of support and understanding. I felt the strength that came from standing together as a group. Sergeant Smith approached Michael. The room began to empty. "That was powerful," she said. "You really made a difference." Michael smiled and said, "Sergeant, this is just the beginning. We've started a conversation, and now we need it takes time for change to stick. But tonight was a positive start." Smith agreed, "And we'll do that. Keep moving forward together." That evening, as Michael departed from the community center, he felt a surge of energy, a sense of purpose. The events of the last few days had been hard, but they had. Additionally, things were changing. Michael knew that the tides were slowly but surely turning. He knew there would be more work to do and more talks to have, but he was ready for it. Things were changing, and he was ready for it. Michael looked up at the night sky and felt hopeful for the first time in a long time. He looked up at the bright stars and took a deep breath. They still had a long way to go, but he was sure they were on the right track, the right way. It had been a few weeks since the community meeting, and there was a new awareness about there have been discussions between the neighborhood and the police force regarding respect bias. Justice kept ringing out in the police station hallways and people's living rooms. Michael Adams resumed his daily walks because he understood that despite his progress, the work was far from finished, like he did before the event. But this time things felt different. The stares that used to hold instead of being suspicious, people now nodded to greet them and waved hello to neighbors who had kept their people from a distance, were now approaching him with smiles and eagerness to talk. Michael liked these small acts of kindness. There were indications that his message had reached its target and that change, albeit slowly, was making its way. One crisp morning, Michael walked down the familiar streets lined with trees. The leaves crunched under his feet. A woman was walking her dog when she saw a group of kids playing in their front yard. The sound of their laughter filled the air. "Good morning, General Adams," she said, giving him a warm smile and a nod. "Morning," Michael answered. Michael turned his head back and continued walking when he noticed a police car slowly approaching from the side. For a moment, his muscles tensed up, reminding him of their last meeting. But as the car got closer, Drew saw that Officer Ramirez was driving. He rolled down his window and smiled. "Good morning, General Ramirez." "How are you today, Michael?" He smiled back, feeling at ease. "I'm fine, Officer Ramirez. I was just enjoying the weather," he said. "Okay," Ramirez nodded. "If you ever need anything, don't be shy about getting in touch. We're here for the community." Michael, as Ramirez drove off, said, "Thank you, officer. It's encouraging to see things going in the right direction." They felt thankful for more than just the new rules and training programs. They were thankful for the shift in their lives. Michael kept walking, passing people who were ready to learn and change their ways of thinking. More neighbors who smiled and bowed at him, and hells the neighborhood, which used to feel, by the end of that day, Michael felt as though a place of judgment was beginning to feel like home. Had a meeting at the police station with Sergeant Laura Smith, who had asked him to talk about the ongoing. As Michael walked into the station, he reforms and listens to his assessment of the situation. He noticed a shift in the mood. There was a sense of purpose and professionalism in the way the cops moved. Some of them stopped to greet Michael as he walked by Smith's office, and the sergeant stood to meet him. General Adams replied with a strong shake of the hand. "Thank you for coming. Please have Michael take a seat," appreciating Smith's straightforward approach. She was concise and direct. Michael appreciated the directness. "I wanted to give you an update on the investigation," Smith told the officer. "After a probe revealed that Davis's actions were illegal, the police force officially fired him. The department's rules state that his termination wasn't merely a reprimand. We set the standards for what we expect from our police officers." Michael seemed to nod. That was the right thing to do. Rail Davis's behavior was wrong, and it hurt the trust between the cops and the community. Smith's side looks thoughtful. "Indeed, we require police officers who are committed to upholding justice and fairness. We've implemented new training standards. We're putting a lot of effort into getting cops to attend de-escalation workshops every month. To keep the lines of communication open, we're also holding regular community meetings to talk about cultural awareness." Conversation. Michael was glad to hear this. "These are important steps, Sergeant. I've seen a change." Smith grinned, saying that the way the police interact with the neighborhood already makes people feel heard. "We've gotten positive feedback. The community feels more connected and is more ready to work with us." It's encouraging to observe how a minor change in perspective can significantly impact outcomes. Michael leaned forward. "Take this seriously, but we can't stop now. We need to keep going. It's not just about rules and training, it's also about attitude. We need to make sure that every officer treats everyone with respect, agrees that they have made progress, and knows that their job is to protect and serve everyone without bias." There's still more to do, though. I'm determined to see this through, and I know other people are too." Michael stood up. He extended his hand again and said, "Thank you, Sergeant, for being a leader and for taking this seriously. Change isn't easy. Together, though, we can make a difference." Smith shook Adams's hand strongly and said, "Thank you, General Adams, for having the courage to speak out. Getting out has led to these changes. We'll never forget how Michael felt as he left the station. The event, which started with suspicion and anger, ended with meaningful conversation and genuine understanding." Change. It was a reminder that even adverse events can be chances to grow. Michael was proud of the steps they had taken, but he knew they had to stay alert to win the fight for justice and equality, dedication and hard work all the time.